Why did a teacher bring two lunches every Friday and always hide one? Students thought it was a habit. Some joked about it. But when she missed a day, the truth started to unravel. A hidden room, a name written in chalk, a boy who was never supposed to be seen. And in the end, a single lunchbox revealed everything. Stay with us to find out why that one act of kindness changed an entire school. And don't forget to subscribe. At Redfield Middle School, Fridays carried a rhythm all their own. The halls buzzed with early dismissal energy, the cafeteria filled with the smell of greasy pizza, and conversations about weekend plans drifted through the classrooms. For most students, it was a countdown to freedom. For Mrs. Grace, the English teacher in room 214, Fridays meant something else entirely. She arrived every morning at exactly 7:35 a.m., long before the first bell rang. Her routine never changed. She set her thermos on the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and placed one lunchbox inside. The second one, a pale blue container wrapped neatly in a cloth, was always tucked carefully into the side pocket of her oversized canvas bag. She never left it unattended, not even for a moment. Students began to notice, as students always do. Some thought she was forgetful. Others assumed she liked to eat in parts. But Owen Collins, a sharp-eyed eighth grader with a knack for catching details, paid closer attention. He sat in the front row, but his eyes often wandered to the back of the room or toward the teacher's desk when she wasn't looking. He noticed that every Friday, shortly after second period, Mrs. Grace would step out and vanish for exactly 15 minutes. It wasn't listed on her schedule, and she never mentioned where she went. Owen, curious and eager for something interesting to share on social media, decided to investigate. At first, it was just a harmless game, something to joke about with friends. But the deeper he looked, the stranger it all became. One afternoon, phone hidden in his hoodie sleeve, Owen followed her from a distance. She moved quickly, not making eye contact with anyone. She slipped into the administrative wing and disappeared behind a door labeled Archive Room, Authorized Staff Only. That room had been locked for years. It was where the school stored outdated records, old textbooks, and unused furniture. 10 minutes later, she emerged, alone, composed, and without the blue lunchbox. She didn't look around, she simply returned to class and resumed the lesson as if nothing had happened. The next week, Owen followed again. Same path, same room, same quiet return. And again, no lunchbox. He told a few classmates, and word spread faster than he expected. Theories flew. Secret boyfriend, strange diet, something medical. No one asked Mrs. Grace directly. They preferred whispers and half-jokes. After all, it was easier to laugh than to wonder too deeply. But then, something changed. On the third Friday, Mrs. Grace came in as usual. Thermos, drawer, lunchboxes, routine perfectly intact. But that afternoon, something slipped. For the first time in months, the second lunchbox never left the desk. It sat there untouched through the end of the school day. And that's when the questions really began. The following Friday arrived colder than usual, with a gray sky hanging low over Redfield like a blanket of unfinished thoughts. Inside the school, the routine buzzed forward as expected. Morning announcements, the shuffle of backpacks, the hum of fluorescent lights. But in room 214, the desk at the front stood noticeably empty. Mrs. Grace hadn't come in. Her absence was rare, almost unheard of. By noon, rumors filled the halls. Some said she had taken a personal day. Others whispered about illness. No one knew for sure. For Owen, the timing felt like a door left ajar. Curiosity had been building for weeks, and now, without the watchful presence of their teacher, the moment felt too tempting to ignore. During the lunch period, he gathered two friends and made his way toward the back hallway, where the archive room sat tucked behind a bend most students never explored. The door was closed, but not locked. Owen pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was stale and still. A single overhead light flickered dimly, casting long shadows against the yellowed filing cabinets and dusty shelves. The room smelled of cardboard, old ink, and forgotten years. They stepped inside cautiously, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust and disuse. Toward the far corner, behind a stack of obsolete geography textbooks, they found something that didn't belong to the school. A plastic folding chair had been set up near the wall. Beside it, a faded plaid blanket neatly folded over its back. On the ground sat an empty lunch container and a collapsible cup, still damp at the rim. Next to it lay a worn stack of library books and an old MP3 player with a cracked screen, still faintly blinking. But what drew their eyes most was the backpack. It was military-style, dark green canvas with visible stitching along the edges as if it had been mended by hand. On the front flap were the stitched initials. DC, none of them spoke. The room was too quiet for sound, too heavy with something unspoken. They didn't touch the bag. They didn't need to. The initials lingered in their minds, echoing through their silence. Who was DC? The name meant nothing to them, but everything about the setup, private, organized, hidden, told them this wasn't a forgotten supply stash. Someone had been living here, or at least spending time, regularly. Ideas began to swirl. Maybe it was Grace's son. Maybe it was a former student she had taken under her wing. Maybe it was someone the school didn't even know existed. The theories shifted between whispers and wild guesses, but none felt solid enough to settle the growing unease. They left everything untouched and exited as quietly as they had come in. For the rest of the day, they avoided the topic in class. No one wanted to be the first to admit how strange it felt. But someone, though none of them admitted who, eventually told the security guard. The next morning, the archive room door was shut tight, a new lock installed. A printed notice appeared on the teacher's lounge bulletin board. Effective immediately, access to the administrative wing is temporarily restricted. Please direct any inquiries to the principal's office. The hallway beyond that corner remained silent, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the story and chosen to keep it hidden a little while longer. A week later, something shifted quietly in the rhythm of the school. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, just an empty seat in the back of room 214. Nick Danvers didn't come to school that Monday. There was no announcement, no call for concern from students, no raised eyebrows. For most, it went unnoticed. But for Mrs. Grace, it didn't. Nick had always been easy to overlook. He kept to himself, arrived early, left late, and rarely spoke unless called upon. He wore the same jacket every day, dark green with worn sleeves, and carried a backpack that looked far too large for his slight frame. His hair was always a bit uneven, as if trimmed without a mirror. He took his notes meticulously, but never volunteered. In the cafeteria, he usually found a seat near the exit, eating quietly or sometimes not at all. Mrs. Grace noticed the silence where Nick usually sat. She glanced toward the back of the room several times that morning, her eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. She didn't mention his name. She didn't ask the class if anyone had seen him. But a shadow of unease settled behind her calm demeanor, as if the absence weighed heavier than she let on. The day passed slowly, filled with the usual noise of hallway traffic and the shuffle of paper, but something about the atmosphere felt dulled. During lunch, the faculty room was unusually quiet. Teachers checked emails, sipped coffee, and tapped at keyboards. No one mentioned Nick. Perhaps they hadn't noticed yet, or perhaps they assumed he was homesick. In schools, assumptions often take the place of questions. That evening, as the sky darkened and temperatures dropped below freezing, the night custodian, Carlos, made his usual rounds through the back corridors. As he stepped outside for a smoke break near the maintenance lot, he caught sight of movement near the rear exit. It was Mrs. Grace, coat buttoned, scarf tight around her neck. Walking beside her was a figure, almost swallowed by an oversized hoodie. The boy carried a backpack and kept his head low. They didn't speak. Together, they walked out of the rear gate and onto the ice-slicked road that curved away from the school. Carlos didn't call out. He simply watched them go, the two figures becoming silhouettes against the pale wash of streetlights. He'd never seen Mrs. Grace leave that way before. The next morning, a janitor opening the rear doors found something sitting just outside on the landing. It was a cardboard box, carefully taped shut. On top was a folded note written in neat, deliberate handwriting. It read, "Thank you for everything." Inside the box were several books, some from the school library, others from Mrs. Grace's personal shelf. Nestled beside them was a thermos, still warm, and a folded blanket with a patch sewn onto the corner, a stitched CD in faded blue thread. No one knew who had left it, but the gesture resonated louder than any announcement. It was quiet. It was intentional. And it was enough to make the school stop for just a moment and wonder what they had missed. It started quietly, like most things that matter. Early Monday morning, long before homeroom began, Mr. Whitaker, one of the older science teachers, took a shortcut through the back stairwell near the gym. It wasn't unusual. That stairwell was used mostly by staff, a dim, cold corridor with echoing steps and peeling paint tucked between boiler rooms and old storage closets. The walls were bare concrete, untouched by the bright posters that covered the main hallways. But that morning, something caught his eye on the second landing. Written neatly in white chalk, centered on the wall between two exposed pipes, was a name. Danvers, Charlie, 2007-2012. At first, he thought it was graffiti, but there was nothing crude or careless about it. The handwriting was steady, each letter spaced with precision. The date range sat beneath the name like an epitaph. It didn't look like a joke or a prank. It looked like memory. He stood there for several seconds, frowning, before pulling out his phone and snapping a photo. By the time the first bell rang, the picture had already reached the front office. The principal, Mr. Kessler, stared at the image in silence. He recognized the last name, but couldn't place the student immediately. It had been over a decade since Charlie Danvers was enrolled. His file was buried deep in the archives, in the same wing that had recently been locked down. Within the hour, Mr. Kessler convened an emergency staff meeting. A dozen teachers, the counselor, and the vice principal crowded into the conference room. Most came in with curiosity. Some assumed it was about the vandalism. But when Kessler entered, holding a slim manila folder and placed it on the table, the mood shifted. He explained who Charlie was. A student once enrolled at Redfield from 2007 to 2012. Quiet, polite, unremarkable on paper. His record stopped abruptly with no formal transfer. At the time, it hadn't raised alarm. Families moved, kids changed schools, it happened all the time. But behind the paperwork was a darker truth. The Danvers family had lived on the outskirts of Redfield, past the edge of the bus lines, in a crumbling farmhouse surrounded by pine and silence. Their mother had died in a fire when Nick, the younger brother, was still in elementary school. The father, a volatile man with a criminal record, was arrested soon after. That left the boys in the care of their grandfather, Frank Danvers, a retired Marine with no income beyond a modest disability check and a deep mistrust of outside help. Charlie had attended school until his final year of middle school. Then, without fanfare or explanation, he disappeared from the system. There were whispers, an accident, a winter storm, something sudden and final, but no one had ever confirmed it. No obituary, no formal statement, just absence. Nick had remained. Same name, same eyes, according to a few who remembered Charlie. But where his older brother had been outgoing and clever, Nick was almost invisible. He arrived early, left late, and rarely spoke. He walked to school every day, even in snowstorms. He kept his head down, turned in his work, and never asked for anything. Most teachers assumed he was simply shy. Then the truth emerged. Over the years, Nick had spent nights inside the school. Not many, just the ones when the furnace at home stopped working, or when the food supply had run out. He never took anything. He didn't make noise. He simply found corners where cameras didn't reach, where warmth and safety could last until morning. Mrs. Grace had known, not at first perhaps, but she noticed what others missed, the worn soles of his shoes, the way he lingered at his locker when everyone else had left. The assignments turned in early, written by hand on lined paper when others were typed. And on a cold February morning, she had followed him, discreetly from a distance, and discovered the truth. She never confronted him, never made him explain. She simply began bringing an extra lunch every Friday, leaving it where he could find it, adding little extras, a thermos of soup, a wrapped cookie, sometimes a folded note with the word tomorrow, written softly in pen. She didn't want to embarrass him. She just wanted him to make it through the week. She didn't tell the administration. She didn't ask for help. She didn't want attention. For her, it wasn't about charity. It was about respect, about dignity, about doing the right thing when no one was looking. The staff sat in silence. Some looked down. Others blinked away the realization of just how much they had missed. It wasn't just about Nick. It was about all the cracks in the system they had walked past without noticing. After the meeting, Mr. Kessler visited the stairwell. The name was still there, untouched. He stood before it for a long while. Then he told the janitor not to wash it off. Not yet. That day, the name Charlie Danvers returned to the halls of Redfield not as a file or a whisper, but as something living, written in chalk, held in memory, and finally seen. A week after the chalk name appeared on the wall, Nick Danvers returned to school. He walked through the front entrance just as the morning bell rang, head low as always, backpack hanging from one shoulder. But something had changed. The usual silence that followed him down the hallway was gone. In its place were quiet nods, small gestures, Simple acknowledgments that said more than words ever could. In homeroom, someone had left a small pack of chocolate on his desk. On the side, a note written in block letters read, "For later." During second period, a classmate slid a mechanical pencil across the table when his own broke. At lunch, he found a spot already cleared for him, not next to the trash cans like before, but near the windows, with a view of the snow-covered baseball field. When he opened his locker after gym class, a new winter jacket was hanging inside. No note, no name, just a tag still attached and sleeves that finally fit. Nick didn't say much that day. He didn't smile, didn't cry. But when the final bell rang and the school began to empty, he lingered a little longer at his desk, as if waiting for the noise to settle before moving again. That Friday morning, Mrs. Grace arrived early as usual. The sky outside was still dim, the sun barely brushing the tops of the hills surrounding Redfield. She unlocked her classroom, turned on the heater, and set her things on the desk: thermos, graded papers, and a book she was halfway through. But something new waited for her that morning. A blue envelope rested on top of her planner. It was slightly bent at the corners, sealed carefully, and addressed in a neat, blocky handwriting. Her name wasn't on it, but she knew immediately who it was from. She sat down, turned on the desk lamp, and opened it without hesitation. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper folded twice. The writing was slow and deliberate, each letter pressed into the page with purpose. It read, "You saved me, even when I thought no one was watching. Thank you for every Friday, and for my brother, Nick." She read it once, then again. Her hands trembled slightly, not from surprise, but from the weight of something finally spoken. She folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it gently in the inside pocket of her bag, where it joined a small collection of things she had never shared with anyone. Notes from students, pressed flowers, an old photograph of a boy in a cadet uniform with the name Charlie handwritten on the back. Later that day, as students moved between classes and the intercom buzzed with afternoon announcements, Mrs. Gray stepped out into the main hallway. She passed the trophy case in the library, pausing at a space that had been empty just a week earlier. Where the old bulletin board used to hang, now stood a new display. At the top, in gold letters cut from construction paper, was the message, "In memory of Charlie Danvers, and in honor of those who chose to care." Below the words was a framed photo. It showed a boy in a junior cadet uniform standing tall, hand at his side, a proud but quiet smile on his face. His eyes mirrored Nick's, watchful, serious, holding something deeper than their years allowed. Beneath the photo, barely noticeable unless you were looking closely, was a printed line of small text. Initiative M. Grace. She didn't linger. She didn't wait for anyone to comment. She simply took one last glance at the image, then turned and walked back to her classroom. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge of evergreens that circled the town, the hallway lights stayed on a little longer than usual. Students passed the wall on their way out. Some stopped, others didn't. But the name stayed. The image stayed. And behind the quiet, behind the kindness and the small, careful gestures, something lasting had begun to take root. Spring arrived slowly in Redfield, with the snow retreating from the sidewalks in uneven patches and the trees just beginning to bud along the edges of the schoolyard. The days grew longer, the air softer, and a quiet anticipation settled over Redfield Middle School. It had been weeks since the hallway display had gone up, weeks since the chalk name had been written and left untouched, weeks since Nick's quiet return. Something had shifted. Not just in him, not just in room 214, but across the whole school. On the first Friday of April, the school launched what it called the Day of Silence. No announcements played over the loudspeakers. There were no bells signaling the change of periods. Teachers adjusted their schedules and students moved between classes by instinct, guided by the steady rhythm of the day. No posters were hung, no speeches were made. Only one thing waited for them when they arrived that morning. On each desk in every classroom, a small white card with a single sentence printed in gray ink. Look around. Someone near you might need your attention. The message was unsigned. There was no explanation, no instruction. And yet, as students read the words, a strange stillness took hold. Whispers softened, laughter thinned. The building didn't fall silent exactly, but the noise changed. It became purposeful, considerate. Eyes lifted from screens, hands reached without being asked. Doors were held open longer. There was space in the air where usually there was only noise. That afternoon, the gymnasium filled for a school-wide assembly. Rows of chairs were lined across the floor, students and staff filtering in quietly, without music, without fanfare. At the front stood a table draped in a plain white cloth, and behind it the principal waited. When the room settled, he stepped forward and posed a single question. If you've ever been helped without asking for it, by a teacher, a friend, or even a stranger, I invite you to stand. There was a pause, the kind that stretches just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Then one student stood, then another. A teacher rose in the back row. A cafeteria worker lifted her hand and slowly got to her feet. Within moments, half the gymnasium was standing. And then, from the third row near the aisle, Nick rose. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He walked to the front with something in his hands, a cardboard box old and worn at the corners. He stepped up beside the principal and set the box gently on the table. Then he opened it and carefully removed a pale blue lunchbox. It was clean, wrapped in a folded cloth. He placed it at the center of the table and stepped back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Mrs. Grace, seated off to the side among the faculty, looked at the lunchbox for a long moment. Then she nodded once, just a small movement, but enough. She didn't move to the stage, she didn't wave. She simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching. What followed was not applause. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was something quieter and deeper. The entire audience rose, students, teachers, staff, volunteers. People who had never spoken to Nick. People who had never met Charlie. People who hadn't understood what a small act of consistency, of care, of quiet dignity could mean until they saw it reflected in a gesture as simple as returning a lunchbox. In that moment, words felt unnecessary. Because sometimes to change a life, you don't need permission or spotlight or praise. Sometimes you just need to show up with a warm meal and do it again and again until someone notices they're not alone.